Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the first R program. So R is an informal organization of students and researchers of the Champalimaud Neuroscience program, and we want to contribute to a world moved by creative and critical thinking. In order to do that, we organize events and seminars in which we explore different subjects from a scientific and a non-scientific perspective. This time we have a program. We call it a program because it's composed of different events and, in this case, workshops. The idea is that you come to the events and we can explore more deeply the subject. So when you come to the second or the third event, you'll come with new questions and new thoughts about the subject. Tonight we're going to talk about dance. So we will have 3 events. This is the first one, diving into dance. And then we'll have the second one on April 26th and the third one on May 7th. So dance has always been part of our human culture. We don't know exactly when humans started dancing, but the first archaeological evidence of humans dancing dates back from 9,000 years ago in the rock shelters of Bhimbetka in India. But if you look at a 3 or 4 months old child, probably you notice that they already have a tendency to move rhythmically to the sound of music. Can you play that, please? Thank you. So maybe you can put your babies doing this. So we have always used dance in many social activities. We use it for celebrations, for ceremonies, for rituals, but also for competitions. So this was probably one of the very first forms of storytelling for us. As some of you who might have come to the Storytelling Art event, you've heard that storytelling plays a very important function for us to learn from each other, for knowledge to pass through generations and generations, and to experience feelings and emotions in stories, in the virtual world of the stories, that we can then learn and use in our real-life decisions. You can also see the importance of dance in building a cultural life and giving feelings of community. For instance, that's why we still have the survival of folk dances. And even in the globalized world of today, you see that people that practice, for instance, capoeira or hip-hop or dances, and they're spread all over the world, they don't know each other, but they still feel some sense of community that the practice of that dance gives to their lifestyle. So if this concept is so deep-rooted in our culture, in our human nature, maybe it looks like it's trivial to ask what is dance. But maybe if I ask you, you'll have a hard time giving me an answer about it. So St. Augustine said something very interesting about time, and if we misquote him and substitute time for dance, it would be, what then is dance? If no one asks me, I know what it is. If I wish to explain it to him who asks, I do not know. So if we can try to explore this concept of dance, that's what we're going to try during this entire program, to tackle this question. Let's have a look at some videos with different human activities that might or might not be considered as dance. So in this video, you saw some examples that we generally consider very easily as dance. For instance, the classical ballet dancer or the malhão malhão. But we also saw people walking in strange ways. We saw a guy pretending he was playing a guitar in an air guitar contest, and we saw a guy juggling with fire. But if we try to classify what was dance and what was not, it's very hard to define a boundary between what it is and what it's not. So maybe there's a spectrum, and we might have a hard time classifying it. So if we have a look at the Wikipedia page about dance, and we made a word cloud with this page, the concept that shows up more in the page is music. Then you have ballet and performance and different styles of music, like African, American. So it's more about trying to classify the dance. But we have also asked you guys, when you signed up for this event, to tell us a word that you'd associate with dance. And this is the word cloud made with your choices. So it's quite different from the Wikipedia page. So you still have music, and it shows up pretty often, but mostly you chose freedom, happiness, fun, movement, joy, and life. Then there are other examples like self-expression, rhythm, relaxation. There's a Michael Jackson. There's nice events. There's even a sausage. I don't know why. But these words are mostly about very strong and positive emotions. So the Wikipedia page and you are quite different. So dance for you, it's probably something related to feelings. If you look at the dictionary definition of dance, it says to move one's feet or body or both rhythmically in a pattern of steps, especially to the accompaniment of music. This definition is a bit weird because it looks like your feet are not part of your body, but let's ignore that. And what we're going to do is to try to have a scientific approach to this question. So we have a question, what is dance? And we have an hypothesis, which is the English dictionary definition. So we need testing, and we need to analyze it. That's what we're going to do throughout the program, and we will start with Carey, who will show us what the brain has to do in order to perform dance. So now I'm happy to introduce Carey. She's a principal investigator here at the Champalimaud Neuroscience program. She is from the USA, from Philadelphia. She did her PhD in San Francisco and then moved to Harvard University, and then she came here. Antonia Gruneberg, she's a PhD student here at the Champalimaud also, and she's also a dancer. So she will help Megan show you some concepts that will be explored. So please welcome Megan.
So as a neuroscientist who studies the neural control of movement, I find dance fascinating. And in science, as scientists, usually when we find a question fascinating, it's because it's a question that we don't have a good answer to. And so the first question you might want to know about how the brain does anything is where in the brain it happens. And I can tell you where in the brain we hear, where in the brain we see. I can even tell you which parts of the brain are required for complex activities like language. But dance, I can't answer that question. And the reason is because dance is so complex that it actually requires your entire brain. So when you're dancing, you're using everything. You're using your spinal cord, you're using your brainstem, your cerebellum, and your cerebral cortex. So what is it about dance that makes it so complex and so challenging that you need to use your entire brain to do it? Well, let's go back to the definition that Sara gave you and try to break it down. We said dance was to move one's feet or body or both rhythmically in a pattern of steps, especially to the accompaniment of music. So in my lab and in many neuroscience labs here at the Champalimaud and around the world, we take an approach to trying to understand brain function by first analyzing the behaviors that the brain is supporting, breaking them down, and then trying to understand and constrain the mechanisms that the brain could be using to perform those behaviors. So tonight, we're all scientists, and what I'm going to ask you to do with me is to take this definition of dance, break it into its parts, and we'll learn about what the brain is doing along the way. So we'll ask what we do when we dance, and then I'll tell you a little bit about what we know about how the brain does those things. So the first, as I said, we're going to break it down. So we'll start with the bare core elements of the definition of dance, and we'll build up one at a time. So the first thing that I think we often think of as the core feature of dance is to move one's feet rhythmically. And in fact, people who don't dance might say, oh, I don't have rhythm, or they say gut rhythm. And it seems like having rhythm or not having rhythm is often what people assume is the determinant between people who are good, comfortable dancers and people who really struggle. But actually, from a neurological perspective, I have to tell you that the rhythmic activity of dancing is just about the easiest thing that you can solve. So it doesn't take any complex brain function to move rhythmically. In fact, there are very small neurons. You only need a few neurons coupled together to make rhythmic movement. And so much of what we know about rhythmic movement we can actually study from very, very simplified organisms, such as the stomach gastric ganglion of a crab. So this is just showing you a diagram of a crab. It has a few neurons wired up together. We know how they're connected to each other. And just this simple network of individual neurons, because of the way they're wired up, and some neurons excite each other and some inhibit each other, this can create a very robust rhythm with different neurons in the network firing at different phases relative to each other. Now, the reason quite a lot of work has been put into trying to understand the neural computations in small circuits like this is because the mechanisms that allow this rhythmic activity in the crab's gastric ganglion are actually very similar to rhythmic mechanisms that appear in your own brain within your spinal cord. So this is just showing that in an isolated vertebrate spinal cord, there are similarly very simple networks of neurons, although here there are many more neurons. It's not one neuron at a time, but very small numbers of classes of neurons, sort of shown here. So these are called central pattern generators, both in the crab and in your spinal cord. And the central pattern generator is simply a small network of neurons that can make rhythmic activity. These are recordings from nerve roots coming out of your spinal cord, not your spinal cord, sorry, an isolated spinal cord in a dish. And the point here is just to show you that you don't need any of the rest of the brain, just an isolated spinal cord in a dish. The neurons inside it are connected up in such a way that when one side is active, the other side is inhibited. And then they can go back and forth in this rhythmic activity, alternating from one side to another, and this is shown here. This is all you need to do rhythmic movement. So if we start with the definition of dance as the ability to move one's feet rhythmically, then all you need is your spinal cord. So clearly that's not where the complexity comes in. But of course I've simplified things a little bit because you don't want to just move your feet rhythmically. You want to move your feet rhythmically when you want to, so it's a voluntary action. And to make a voluntary action, you need this part here, which is called your motor cortex. And I did skip over some other quite important things that you need in order to move your feet rhythmically, including the ability to breathe. And so I'm going to go ahead and put in your brainstem, which is really critical for basic life functions like breathing, although it also will play a role later on. Okay, so the first thing we have is a demonstration that Antonia has agreed to perform. And now imagine... Antonia is now going to show you what dancing would look like if all you had was a central pattern generator in your spinal cord. So she's moving her feet rhythmically, but maybe that's not yet quite what we would call dance. Thank you, Antonia. So, and you knew this because because you saw the definition at the beginning. And so it's not just rhythmically moving your feet, it's moving your feet rhythmically, especially to the accompaniment of music. So now as soon as we're putting music into the mix, we have to face the fact that when you're dancing, you're getting all kinds of sensory input. And of course, you're getting auditory input in the form of the music coming into your ears that you can hear. And this is the part of your brain where, the part of your cerebral cortex that's involved in hearing. So you're hearing music, but I think I just want to take a moment to point out that this isn't the only kind of sensory input that you're getting when you're dancing. When you're dancing, you're also seeing, so you're using your visual system. And if you're dancing with a partner, your sense of touch is also incredibly important, because very subtle changes in touch and pressure and direction are the only thing that will guide the person who's following to know exactly what movement they're supposed to make. So we have at least 3 senses that are very important for dance. I would hazard to guess that it's possible you might actually use your sense of smell, at least in choosing a partner. I really hope that you're not using your sense of taste very much while you're dancing. But I have to tell you, so that's 5, right? Hearing, seeing, touching, smelling, tasting. There are actually 2 more senses that are very, very important for dance. Even though you probably think there are 5 senses, we really have 7. And in fact, the 2 that are never considered in the list of 5 are incredibly important in this context. So dance, if you count smell, actually uses 6 of our 5 senses. And the 2 senses that are missing, the first one is your vestibular system. So this is your sense of balance. And this is just a diagram showing that your vestibular system is actually inside your ear. So here is the cochlea that is inside your ear, and this is where sound is transduced into electrical signals that are sent to your brain. And motion is transduced into electrical signals in this vestibular part of your inner ear. It's actually shown here. Okay. So your vestibular system gives you a sense of balance. Now, many of you, probably all of you, at least when you were children, have had the experience of spinning around and around and around and around, right? And you stop spinning and you're dizzy, and it feels like the world is moving the other way, and if you go for too long, then you'll just have to fall down. Now, this is because the fluid that's inside these canals actually keeps spinning after you stop. So in dance, it's actually very important. First, you have to be aware of where you are, whether or not you're balanced when you're moving around, and especially during the corpora performance, I think you'll be aware of this later. But also you have to think about if you're moving too much as a dancer, you have to be careful not to induce dizziness in yourself. And so if you've ever seen ballerinas dancing when they spin, they actually use a technique called spotting, in which they try to keep their head forward and their eyes fixated on a point, and then just move their heads rapidly, much faster, but not continuously, so that they won't get dizzy. So of course we have Antonia, who is a trained dancer, who's going to show us how this technique works. Thank you. Because she uses this trick, she's less likely to get dizzy while she's dancing. And it's also, there have been recently, very recently, within the past few years, tests done on ballerinas compared to other kinds of female athletes, and have actually shown that there are changes structurally in some of the vestibular parts of the brain. So they think that ballerinas are actually also able to suppress the vestibular signals that are coming in to prevent themselves from getting dizzy. So the other sense that you use when you are dancing is called proprioception. And this is the sense of where your body is in space. So if you close your eyes and move your arms, or your legs, or any part of your body, you have a mental sense of the shape that your body is in, right? And this is actually because between your spinal cord and your muscles, you have efferent connections that are going from the spinal cord to the muscle, motor neurons that are controlling the movement. But there are also feedback neurons that are coming from the muscles or the tendons into the spinal cord that are carrying information about the tension that's existing in each of your muscles at any given time. So the vestibular system, the sense of balance, and proprioception, the sense of where your body is in space, are incredibly important in dance. In fact, without them, you'd be sort of lying on the floor in a heap just barely rhythmically moving your feet, right? And at least for me, this doesn't usually happen until quite late in the evening if I've been out dancing. So we have sensory information. It's really a barrage of sensory information that's coming in over these 6 senses. And we have to figure out what to do with it, right? We take in this external information, plus we have the information, the proprioception, internal information. And we need to perform what we call sensory motor integration. We have to take these sensory inputs and integrate them with each other and use them to guide and to generate actions that are an appropriate response to those sensory inputs. So we go back to our brain. Now we have motor cortex and the downstream motor areas. We also have these sensory cortices. And then we're going to add in what's called association cortex, which is regions where you find neurons that respond not just to visual stimuli, but to the combination of visual and auditory stimuli, or to the combination of vestibular and even motor signals. So this is where you see mixing of the different sensory inputs, as well as with the signals about the movements that you're in the process of making. So we have one more demonstration of what happens. Okay, so at this point, Antonia is doing a great job of moving rhythmically. Okay, she's still only moving her feet, right? And so we need her to not only move her feet rhythmically, but actually she's supposed to move her feet or her body or both. And so she does that rhythmically, especially to the accompaniment of music, then she'll really be dancing, right? Thank you. So Antonia's really a trained dancer, so she did that as a big favor to me. But for me personally, this is where my dancing breaks down. And the point is that it isn't enough to just move your feet or your body or both. You have to do it in some kind of coordinated fashion, right? So this is hard for me. It's also hard for the brain. And conveniently enough, it turns out that this is actually the problem that we study in my laboratory here at the Champalimaud. And so it turns out that the part of your brain that you need in order to coordinate the movements of the different parts of your body so that they're making coherent movement is the cerebellum. So I'll just tell you briefly, give you a sense of what we work on. We don't actually study dance. It's a very complex behavior. We can discuss more whether it's seen in animals or just in humans, but we do try to study the control of complex coordinated movement. But we use mice to study this movement, and we study not actually dancing mice, but walking mice. So we study locomotion. And we try to use genetic tools to manipulate activity in specific populations of neurons, see how that changes activity within well-defined neural circuits, and see how those changes relate ultimately to the generation of the behavior. So this is just showing you how mice walk. It's really, we're trying to strip things down as far as we can. And so we're first just looking at the pattern of movement of the 4 limbs of the mouse. So this is really fairly equivalent to Antonia moving her feet and her arms. So what I want you to see is that when the mouse walks, he moves the diagonal paws together. Okay? So the front left and the hind right are moving at the same time, and then the other pair of diagonal paws is moving out of phase with that. And this is really consistent. So mice do this no matter what speed they're walking, and we can represent this in the lab with some different graphs that we use. One of them is just here to show that this yellow and blue paw tend to move together, and the green and red paw tend to move together, and they're opposite of each other. So what happens in mice that have a deficit in cerebellar function? So here again is a normal mouse walking with this nice, we call it a symmetrical trot, this diagonal alternation. And this on the bottom is a mouse that has degeneration of the output neurons of the cerebellum, the Purkinje cells. Now look here at the pattern of the paws, right? You still see left-right alternation in the front, but the diagonal relationship has broken down. This is just showing you in the movie. Still able to walk forward, but has this deficit in coordinating the movements across the whole body. And we can represent that with a graph that shows now that yellow and green are off of this axis, no longer opposite with the red and the blue. Okay, so if we add the cerebellum in, fortunately enough for Antonia, she has a cerebellum, and so she is actually capable of coordinating her hands and her arms. Okay, and she could do this all night. But it might not be, it might not be the most exciting thing to watch, and so why is that? That's because all she's doing now is moving exactly the same way. She's doing it beautifully, she's doing it in a coordinated fashion, but we have to add one more thing into the definition, which is she's supposed to be dancing in a pattern of steps. Now, let's have her dance in a pattern of steps. Okay, so she's perfectly well. She's perfectly well coordinated, but maybe she could work a little bit on which steps she selects to make, right? So the next thing that's really important is the selection and the sequencing of the actions of the pattern of steps that she makes. And so there are, of course, parts of the brain dedicated to this, and in particular the basal ganglia, which are on the inside, which is why they're sort of shown here in a transparent way, are very important for selecting the appropriate actions and performing them in correct sequences. And one of the really important things about selecting actions is to make sure that they have the desired outcome. So this is something, of course, that comes into play in dancing because you might want to impress the person you're performing for or the person you're dancing with. And so this is actually, this action selection will actually be one of the topics on the third event where Rui Costa from the Champalimaud, who studies how these things happen in the brain, will be talking about improvisation and the generation and selection of particular actions. So you can use this basal ganglia for choosing the appropriate actions and sequencing them together. Of course, some dance is done, is already choreographed and is planned in advance very, very precisely. And so in this case, you need to actually have a plan for what movements you're going to make. And you have to choreograph it. And dancers actually, when they're learning new routines that are very tightly scripted, they often will undergo different kinds of training, right? Clearly they need to learn how to execute the particular movements, but they also need to learn the routine. And so dancers will often do something called marking, which is sort of walking through the routine slowly and with minimal movement. And this is actually also very, very important for learning the routine because there's this learning of the plan of the movement and the sequence of the movement that is just as important as learning to execute the moves themselves. And so together with the basal ganglia, you use the regions in the frontal cortex that are important for the planning of movement. And this is clearly also important for dance. So now we have completed our definition. We're ready for one more demonstration. So now she's moving her feet and her body rhythmically in a pattern of steps, especially to the accompaniment of music. Thank you very much. So then to summarize, our analysis of what we do when we dance actually turns out to be quite complex. We have to move our body rhythmically to the accompaniment of music in a coordinated way and in an appropriate learned and sequenced pattern of steps. So that's almost all of the brain, but there's one little corner that I left off here. And so I think we can look again at the definition and see if we think there might have been something missing. Because I think we would agree that while this isn't a complete definition of dance in any sense, there are some things that we generally associate with dance that have been left off a little bit, such as we're moving our body through space when we dance, we're doing it with or in front of other people, we're often using it as a way to express emotion, or to alter the emotional state or even the cognitive state of people who are watching us, of other people. And so when we factor in all these things, we need to find a place in the brain for them. And so there are many regions, again, some of them are on the inside, but some of them are near here, that allow us to move appropriately through space and to communicate with other people. And this idea of dance as communication will be the subject of the second R event. So the dancing brain is really, you're using your whole brain when you dance. And so I have good news for you, whether you dance or you don't. If you do dance regularly, I can tell you that actually in a study of older patients, there was a study in the New England Journal of Medicine, and the idea was to see how different activities, engaging in different activities, could protect against dementia. And so they looked at cognitive activities and they looked at physical activities. So they had people who were regular bicyclists, they had people who were regular swimmers, people who read, who did crossword puzzles, who played games. And they found that while many of the cognitive activities were protective against dementia, that none of the physical activities were, except for dance. And this is probably because it isn't just a physical activity, it's a cognitive activity as well. And since you're using your whole brain, it's very good for your brain. So that's the good news for those of you who don't, or who do dance. For those of you who don't dance, I guess the good news is that I can tell you it's really hard, right? There are so many ways, that you can go wrong. And so you should, you take comfort in the fact that there could be one very small mistake anywhere in your brain that could be making it difficult for you. So I guess the final message that I want to leave you with is that I hope as you're watching the capoeira performance tonight, you'll be thinking a little bit about just how many challenges the brains of the performers are engaged in as they're performing. And I also hope that the next time you go dancing, you'll remember that your brain is dancing with you. Okay, so thank you very much to the So I just want to say thank you to the R team, in particular Sara, who organized this particular event. Thank you, of course, to Antonia, who was fantastic stepping in to do the demonstrations, and I gave her very little notice, so it was fantastic. And also, I'd like to thank my lab, especially the locomotion team, who provided some of the data that I showed tonight. So thanks.
So we can take questions to Megan if you want. Podem fazer perguntas em português que nós traduzimos, está bem?
Hello.
Hi.
My name is Sophia, and I want to ask you, you have talked about the music, but you can dance also in the silent. How does it work?
Absolutely. So you don't need any of those sensory inputs to do the dancing, obviously. I mean, you can dance with your eyes closed, you can dance to silence. And actually, so my job tonight was to use the standard definition of dance and try to break that down and analyze what the brain is doing. But we'll have some more discussion throughout the evening about which elements from this definition are actually required and really challenging the definition, because you're absolutely right, it doesn't have to be to music. That's why it says especially to music. So you have to find your inner rhythm in that case.
Thank you.
Hello. Do you consider the aesthetic part as the emotional one, the emotional side?
That's a fantastic question. So I think I'm actually going to not answer it because because after the capoeira performance, Guido will talk about the aesthetics of dance. So maybe you can save that question for him.
Okay. So today, just by casualty, I saw a video of a little girl. She was around 3 years, and she had some syndrome where she had half of her brain removed. And actually by casualty as well, she said that one of her dreams was to become a dancer. How does the brain adapt to such radical changes?
Well, so that could be the subject of another whole R event. But actually, so the brain is very plastic, we say, right? So it can change. It's very malleable, particularly in young children. So I'd say in her case, with a lot of, this is why with damage to the brain, it's very important to do physical therapy. It's one of the reasons, because your brain is plastic, but you need to engage those neural circuits, and you need to build, if you don't have the original circuit that would be used for a particular behavior, you need to train other parts of the brain to make compensatory circuits that can then act to take over the functions that would have been served by the part of the brain that's missing. So this, it turns out, is much easier. It's not easy by any means, but it's much more possible, and the outcomes are very favorable comparatively for children compared to adults. So she should keep trying. And we all should. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't all try to learn to dance a little bit better, myself included.
Good evening. Is dancing, as we know it through your definition, exclusive to humans?
So I think Sara is going to talk about that a little bit. I think it depends how you define it. I mean, there are definitely behaviors even invertebrates that look an awful lot like dance. And if you think about what the goals and the outcomes of dance are, even from an anthropological perspective, you could make the same kinds of arguments in, say, the mating rituals of spiders and things can look a lot like dance, and in the end, how different are they from human dance?
Thank you.
It's a good question.
Sometimes when people are dancing or in ancient rituals of dance, people go into a trance state. So my question is there any study what happens to the brain when people go into this altered state of consciousness?
I don't know. There are some neuroscientists in the audience that might know. Do you know? I don't know. You know? Oh.
Thank you.
I think it's a great question. I mean, I think this, and I didn't really touch on this, but the social aspects of dance, I also kind of lumped the social and the emotional aspects of dance together, and that will be discussed a little bit more at the second event. But I think, it's not just dancing in a trance state. I think there are all kinds, this is just my sort of personal thinking on this, but I mean, I think all kinds of religious rituals as well, right, that prey on this rhythm, right, setting a group of people to the same rhythm, and this can have profound impact on one's sense of community and one's sense of belonging, and so I think, dance, as it uses the whole brain, right, can be very powerful in that way, and so doing it with other people can really tap into that sensation, that feeling. But how? Don't know.
Thank you.
Okay, so there's one more. Okay, last question.
Good evening. I was just wondering if the meditative quality of the dance, if you're studying in that way, or if that could also be a cause for the rejuvenating power of dance.
Absolutely. And again, in this emotional part, there can be release of all kinds of substances in the brain that can cause euphoria, and that can come actually just from physical exercise, right? So even you can get a runner's high from running, endorphins, and so on. And so even more so again for dance that is using so much of the brain, not just the physical activity, but the cognitive activity. Music on its own can have those kinds of effects, so when you put them all together, it can be very powerful.
Okay, thank you. Let's thank Megan again.